The night the river took his daughter, he swore he'd never step near it again. Yet years later, when the rains return and the flood rises, her mare, wild-eyed and trembling, stands at its edge, waiting. The man who once built fences now faces the one thing he cannot contain, his own guilt. Wind sweeps the valley, thunder answers memory, and every drop of rain feels like her voice calling from the other side. He knows this isn't about crossing water. It's about crossing the distance between who he was and who he still needs to forgive. The storm had been building all day, thickening in the valley like breath before a cry. By nightfall, the sky had folded itself into layers of bruised cloud, and the air smelled of iron and river mud. Rain came in sudden bursts, first a whisper, then a pounding rhythm against the tin roof of the barn. Elias Horn could hear it from the porch, boots half-laced, rope coiled in one hand. Beyond the house, lightning ripped across the ridgeline, and the river answered with a guttural roar. He shouted her name into the storm. The wind swallowed it. Somewhere below, the mare screamed. Her silhouette flickered against the flashes, hooves sunk in deep mud, muscles quivering, nostrils flaring white in the dark. The river had already spilled past its banks, twisting through the pasture like a live thing. It wasn't water anymore. It was movement, sound, power without direction. "Cross!" he yelled, voice raw. The rope strained between his hands as he pulled, boots sliding through muck. On the far side stood a small figure, his daughter, barefoot, her dress plastered against her legs. She was reaching toward the mare, calm, steady, the way only she could be. "Pa, she won't come."
"Get back!"
he bellowed, but the storm drowned him out. The horse reared, eyes rolling white. Rain sheeted sideways, the rope snapping taut between them, slicing against his palms. Another flash, his daughter stepped closer, her voice soft but urgent, a melody carried on the chaos. The mare stilled for one impossible second, ears flicking toward her. Then the world cracked open. A section of the bank gave way. Water surged through like glass breaking. Elias lunged forward as his daughter disappeared beneath the torrent. The rope went slack, then whipped free. The mare screamed again, a sound too human to be mistaken, and bolted backward, eyes wild with terror. He ran into the current, chest deep before the cold took his breath. The water's force slammed him sideways, spinning him downriver among branches and silt. He grasped at nothing, her hand, her dress, her name, all gone in a rush of sound. When he clawed his way onto the far bank, his body shuddered with more than cold. He screamed her name until the thunder drowned him. The storm did not end quickly. It raged as if the valley itself were grieving. Hours later, when silence finally settled, Elias found the mare still standing near the ruins of the fence, soaked, shaking, eyes fixed on the river. The rope dangled from her halter like a broken thread. He walked toward her, every step sinking deep into mud. She did not move. Her sides heaved, breath shuddering in time with the dying storm. For a long moment they stood together in the ruin, man, horse, river. The air smelled of wet wood and loss. Lightning flickered far away, retreating beyond the hills. When he finally reached out, the mare flinched, then stilled. Beneath his trembling hand, her coat was cold as stone. Elias lifted his eyes to the river. It had returned to its channel, deceptively calm now, whispering over rocks as if it had not just taken everything. He knelt in the mud until dawn, the storm's echo pulsing faintly in his ears. The mare remained beside him, unmoving, her gaze fixed on the water. In the first light, mist rose from the valley floor, soft and indifferent. The river gleamed pale silver, washing away the last traces of night. Elias did not cry. He only whispered, voice hoarse and broken. "You should have crossed." The mare lowered her head. Somewhere, deep beneath the surface, the current carried his words away. The morning after the flood smelled of iron and ash. The valley lay quiet under a sky scraped clean, as though the storm had wrung every sound from the earth. The river retreated into itself, calm and deceitful, leaving behind torn fences, driftwood, and the hollow bones of a home. Elias moved through the wreckage without speaking. He found one of his daughter's boots wedged between two stones caked in river clay. He turned it over once, twice, and then set it down again without a word. There was no body to bury, only absence heavier than the mud. The mare stood in the corral, trembling with exhaustion. Her mane was tangled with reeds, her flanks streaked with dried mud. Elias couldn't look at her without feeling his pulse tighten. The animal had lived, and his child had not. That was all his mind could hold. Days passed in silence. He worked without direction, patching fences that didn't need mending, stacking wet wood that would never burn. The neighbors came and went with casseroles and condolences, but grief turned his hearing dull. When they finally left, he stayed by the barn, staring at the mare through the rain-streaked slats. She met his gaze, unblinking, her breath misting in the chill. It was the same look she'd given him the night of the storm, half fear, half recognition. Weeks bled into months. The mare remained, pacing the same narrow stretch of pasture. Sometimes she would stop at the river's edge, ears twitching toward the distant whisper of water. She never stepped closer. Elias would watch her from the porch with a glass in his hand, the smell of whiskey rising with the damp evening air. Each time she turned from the river, he felt both relief and shame. But the valley remembered what it had taken. The earth grew lush that spring, almost indecently green. Flowers burst along the fence lines, and the air shimmered with the low hum of bees. The river sang again, light and easy, as if nothing had happened. One afternoon, while tending to the pasture grass that had grown too high, Elias found an old comb, his daughter's, wedged between the boards of the fence. A few strands of chestnut hair clung to it. He knelt there for a long time, the air thick with the smell of sun-warmed hay and memory. He looked up to see the mare standing near him, ears forward, nostrils quivering. She took one cautious step closer, then another, until her breath warmed his face. Her eyes were deep, unguarded, carrying something he couldn't name, something patient. "Go on," he muttered, voice breaking on the second word. He raised a hand as if to strike, but she didn't flinch. She only blinked, slow and steady, the way his daughter used to when she was trying to calm a frightened foal. That night, he dreamed of laughter echoing through the barn, the soft rustle of hay, the rhythm of a girl brushing her mare by lantern light. When he woke, the lantern still burned faintly on the wall, its flame shivering in the draught. Through the half-open door, he saw the mare sleeping in her stall, her sides rising and falling with the slow rhythm of peace. For a moment he forgot everything that had come after. The sight was a wound and a balm in the same breath. In the weeks that followed, Elias began to care for her in small, reluctant gestures. He cleaned her hooves, brushed the dried mud from her coat, mended her halter. Each act was a conversation he didn't yet know how to have. She responded with quiet acceptance, no resistance, no fear, just presence. It was as if she understood that both of them were trying to keep something alive that had already gone. On warm evenings, when the wind blew from the west, he would hear the faint sound of river water moving through stones. The mare would lift her head, ears pricked, tail swishing once. He found himself watching her rather than the river, watching the way she refused to yield to ghosts. By the end of summer, the field had regained its calm rhythm. Birds nested in the eaves again, and the grass shimmered silver under moonlight. Elias still spoke little, but when he worked the land, he sometimes caught himself humming an old tune, one his daughter used to sing. It rose unbidden, cracked and low, and though it hurt to hear, he didn't stop. One evening, he found himself standing by the river's edge. The water glided past in soft murmurs, clear and slow, reflecting the amber sky. The mare grazed nearby, close enough for her shadow to touch his boots. For the first time, he didn't turn away. He knelt and touched the surface, cool, alive and endless. The current curled around his fingers like a memory that refused to fade. Behind him, the mare snorted gently, and he felt her presence settle like breath against the back of his neck. The world was quiet again, but this time the silence did not feel empty. It felt like waiting. Years passed like weather, measured not by calendars but by the slow fade of colour from the world. The valley had grown brittle beneath an endless sun, its once green pastures bleached to the hue of bone. The river, that old thief, had dwindled to a narrow scar, its stones exposed and dry. Wind hissed through the tall grass like whispers of a memory no one dared to name. Elias Horn had learned to live inside that silence. His hair had silvered, his hands roughened further by time and stubborn work. He rarely spoke now, and when he did, it was to himself, or to the mare, who lingered in the fields like a ghost tethered to his grief. Her coat had dulled to the colour of ash, and though her steps were slow, her eyes still carried that same quiet watchfulness. One morning he stood at the fence line, looking toward the dry riverbed. The air shimmered with heat, the sky washed white. The mare stood at the far edge of the pasture, her head bowed. Around her the earth cracked open like old paint. "She's lived long enough," Elias muttered, though no one was there to hear. He leaned on the fence rail, feeling the splinters press into his palm. Too long. He told himself it wasn't cruelty, it was mercy. She was old, after all, and what was left here for either of them but drought and ghosts? Still, as he spoke the words aloud, something inside him resisted, the same quiet part of him that remembered a girl's laughter and the way sunlight used to catch in her hair. That night, unable to sleep, he poured himself whiskey and stared at the ledger on the kitchen table. The ink was faded, but the name of the local trader was still legible. He could sell the mare, maybe for enough to cover the coming winter's grain. Someone younger, someone without ghosts, might take her in. The next morning, before the sun had cleared the ridge, he slipped a rope around her neck. She didn't fight. She only looked at him with those patient eyes, and for a moment he faltered. Then he pulled, and she followed, slowly, obediently, the way she had learned years ago when she trusted hands that weren't his. The walk to the traders was long and dry. Dust rose in soft clouds around their feet. Elias said nothing, but his chest felt hollow, as if something in him had already started to leave. When they reached the old road that curved toward the settlement, the mare stopped. Her ears twitched, nostrils flaring toward the east, the direction of the riverbed. Elias tugged, but she refused to move. Her hooves struck the ground with stubborn certainty, her body rigid as iron. "Come on," he growled, pulling harder. The rope tightened, the leather biting into his hands. Still she wouldn't move. Instead, she swung her head toward the horizon, toward the place where the river once ran. A faint wind stirred the air, carrying the dry, almost forgotten scent of water. Elias cursed, wiped sweat from his brow, and yanked once more. That was when she bolted. The rope snapped from his grip, burning his palms raw. He stumbled backward, cursing, as she galloped across the empty field, hooves striking dust, mane streaming like smoke. She didn't stop until she reached the riverbed, the ghost of water shimmering faintly in the heat. By the time he caught up, breathless and furious, she was standing in the center of it, motionless. framed by the barren expanse of stone and sand. "What are you doing?" he shouted, though the sound broke in his throat. The mare turned her head slightly, eyes on him, unafraid. For a moment it felt as though she was looking through him, beyond the years, beyond the man he had become. He took a step closer, boots crunching over dry stone. His anger thinned into something else, confusion, sorrow, something too heavy to name. He stopped a few paces away and sank to his knees. The ground beneath him was cracked and cool, smelling faintly of clay and dust. The mare exhaled slowly, her breath soft and steady. A sound rose faintly in the distance, a trickle, barely audible. Elias looked down and saw it, a thin thread of water seeping through the cracks, running past his knees like a pulse returning to the earth. He closed his eyes. In that sound, the delicate, tentative murmur of returning life, he heard laughter. His daughter's laughter. He saw her again, small and sunlit, brushing the mare's mane, whispering secrets into her ear. The image was so clear it hurt to look at. Elias pressed his hands against the earth, trembling. "I can't," he whispered, voice breaking. "Not again." The mare stepped forward, lowering her head until her muzzle brushed his shoulder. Her touch was gentle, insistent. He stayed there a long while, his fingers tracing the fragile vein of water that wound between the stones. It glistened faintly in the morning light, fragile yet unstoppable. He didn't sell her that day. He didn't go back to the trader or the ledger or the lies he told himself about Mercy. Instead, he removed her halter and left her free to roam the valley. She lingered near the riverbed still, grazing among the dry reeds, her shadow long against the dust. That night, the wind changed. A smell of rain drifted through the open window of the house, faint, promising. Elias sat on the porch, watching clouds gather over the western ridge. He didn't move. He only watched, feeling something shift inside him, like the first drop of rain breaking through years of drought. The mare lifted her head in the distance, turning toward the sky, and for the first time in years, Elias whispered her name. Not his daughter's, but the horse's, the name she hadn't heard since that night long ago. "Luna," the word trembled out of him, raw and reverent. The mare's ears flicked, and though the wind swallowed everything else, he swore she heard it. The rain never came that night, only the promise of it. By morning, the sky cleared again, and the sun returned, pale and merciless. But something had shifted in Elias Horn's world. The sound of his own voice, speaking the mare's name, lingered, like a ghost, between him and the silence that had ruled for years. He rose earlier now. He still didn't speak much, but his work regained rhythm. He repaired the barn roof, patched the fences that leaned too long into neglect. Luna followed him through each task, uninvited but unshaken, like a shadow that refused to fall away. Each day she moved a little closer until her presence became a steady beat against his isolation. When he worked in the fields, he could feel her gaze on his back, steady and patient. At first, it unsettled him, the sense that something still expected something from him. But gradually that feeling became less burden and more tether. A reminder that he was not yet entirely gone. By the second winter, the drought deepened. Frost came without snow, leaving the ground as hard as old iron. The days were shorter, the valley stripped of colour. Elias spoke to no one. The world beyond his property had forgotten him as much as he had forgotten it. Yet the mare stayed. She found what grass she could beneath the brittle soil, her endurance as unnatural as his own. At night, when the wind howled down from the hills, Elias dreamed of his daughter. In those dreams, she was always by the river, barefoot, her laughter mingling with the sound of flowing water. Sometimes she called his name, but he could never reach her. He would wake with his throat raw, the echo of her voice fading into the whine of the wind. One morning, he found Luna standing at the riverbed again. The air was cold enough to sting. Frost traced delicate patterns across the cracked stones. The mare's breath rose in soft plumes catching the light. Elias stood beside her, his breath matching hers. "You keep waiting," he muttered. "For what?" She didn't move. Her ears flicked once, catching his tone rather than his words. He followed her gaze to the horizon, where a faint line of mist shimmered. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of drought, the river still lived. Weeks later, a storm brushed past the valley. Nothing like the old tempests, only a pale echo. It left the air damp, the earth darkened in patches. But in one hollow near the pasture, water pooled for the first time in years. Not much, just a shallow mirror that caught the sky. That evening, Elias found Luna standing ankle-deep in it, drinking slowly, her reflection trembling beneath her. The sight held him still. He remembered a much younger mare, bright and strong, carrying his daughter across open fields, their laughter trailing like ribbons through the wind. He couldn't stop the memory this time. It came in full. The day his daughter first brought Luna home, a gift from a neighbor who couldn't afford to keep her. He had warned her, horses like that are wild inside. She'd only smiled. Then she'll understand me? She had. The memory loosened something in him, something buried too deep for words. Later, when Luna cut her leg on a strand of wire, Elias stayed up all night to tend the wound. He cleaned it carefully by lantern light, whispering soft, uncertain words as he wrapped the bandage. His voice shook, but the act steadied him. The smell of iodine mixed with hay, the lantern flame painted gold across her flank. She didn't resist. When he finished, she lowered her head and pressed her muzzle against his shoulder, a gesture of trust so gentle it broke him. He sat down in the straw, tears slipping quietly down his face. He hadn't wept in years. It came not as collapse but as surrender. Tears for his daughter, for time, for the parts of himself that had gone with the flood. Luna's breath warmed his cheek as if to say enough. That night, sleep came easily. He dreamed again, but this time the dream was soft. His daughter brushed Luna's mane by the river, humming the same tune she'd sung as a child. When she looked up at him, she didn't blame him. She only smiled. When he awoke, dawn had turned the horizon pale rose. The frost glittered across the pasture like powdered glass. Luna stood near the fence, watching the sunrise. For the first time, Elias saw beauty in the cold. Through the long winter, man and mare moved through their days in quiet rhythm. He spoke more often now, telling her about the land, about his daughter, about the river that had once been alive enough to terrify him. The words felt strange in his mouth, but each one lightened him, as though memory, once spoken, became air instead of stone. And yet beneath that fragile peace, a tension lingered. He could feel it in the way the wind shifted, in the way Luna sometimes turned her ears toward distant thunder that had not yet arrived. The valley was waiting. The world, he sensed, was not done testing him. One night, a low rumble rolled through the mountains. He woke to it, heart hammering, the sound tugging at the same corner of his soul the river once had. He rose, stepped out into the yard. The stars were hidden behind clouds. The air smelled faintly of moisture, rain that did not yet fall. Across the pasture, Luna lifted her head. Their eyes met in the darkness. Between them, the dry river shimmered faintly with reflected starlight, as though remembering what it once carried. "Not yet," Elias whispered to the air. But even as he said it, he knew the waiting was nearly over. The rain came back the way a memory does, hesitant, trembling, afraid to stay. For 3 days it lingered in mist, softening the edges of the valley, turning dust to clay and silence to sound. The roof pinged lightly at night, the scent of damp earth filling the house like breath after years of holding it in. Elias woke each morning to the faint patter on the window and listened as if to a heartbeat returning after too long an absence. The river stirred again. It began as a thread of motion through the stones, barely visible. Then, slowly, it found its voice, a low murmur like something long asleep, whispering to itself. By the 5th day, it moved freely, a pale serpent of light winding through the valley floor. Elias stood at the bank and watched it form. The sight should have brought comfort, but it did not. He could not look at water without seeing her, his daughter's small frame caught in the torrent, that last look before the river swallowed her name. The sound of flowing water was a wound that refused to close. Luna approached behind him, her hooves silent on the damp earth. She stood beside him, ears forward, eyes on the same silver current. They stayed that way for a long while, man and mare, both still, the air between them thick with unspoken ghosts. "Not again," he said under his breath. The river's rise felt like a challenge. He turned to leave, but Luna didn't move. Her gaze stayed fixed on the water, as if something beyond it was calling her. In the following days, the valley changed. Patches of green emerged from the grey soil. Birds returned, their songs tentative but bright. For the first time in years, the air carried warmth again. Yet within Elias, the thaw only brought confusion. He wanted the world to remain still, predictable. The return of life meant the return of memory, and he wasn't sure he could bear that. That evening, as twilight bled across the fields, he saw Luna near the river again. Her body was rigid, her reflection shimmering beneath her. She stepped closer, one hoof pressing into the shallows. The movement sent ripples outward, small, hesitant, but undeniable. Elias froze where he stood, heart knocking against his ribs. He whispered her name once. The sound trembled in the humid air. Luna turned her head slightly as if waiting for something from him, a word, a gesture, permission. He walked forward slowly, his boots sinking into wet earth. The river's voice grew louder with each step. His reflection joined hers on the water's surface, two figures bound by loss, standing on the edge of something they both feared. "You remember," he said softly. "Don't you?" The mare snorted, tail flicking once, and turned her head toward him. Her eyes shone faintly in the fading light. Dark, deep, steady. He reached out a hand, but his fingers hesitated in midair. He hadn't touched her like this since the night of the storm. When his hand finally came to rest on her neck, it was like touching time itself. Her skin twitched under his palm, warm and alive. A tremor went through him, not from fear, but from release. "I never meant," he began, but the words failed. The river's song filled the silence instead. Gentle, forgiving. A breeze swept across the valley, carrying the smell of rain-soaked grass and the faint sweetness of wildflowers. Luna lowered her head slightly, pressing into his touch. It was the smallest act, but it cracked something open inside him that had long since hardened to stone. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed listening to the rain tapping on the roof. His mind drifted between the present and the past, the sounds merging, his daughter's laughter blending with the murmur of the river outside. For the first time, it didn't make his chest tighten. It made him ache in a softer, almost bearable way. Just before dawn, he rose and went outside. Mist floated low over the ground. glowing faintly in the early light. Luna stood by the fence, her coat slick with dew. When he approached, she lifted her head and took a slow step toward him, her breath warm in the cool air. "Luna," he said, his voice breaking softly. "It's all right." The words carried no command, only surrender. The sky began to lighten. He followed her gaze toward the river, now full enough to move with purpose. The water reflected the pink-orange of the coming day, its surface smooth except for the occasional ripple. It looked harmless, gentle, almost kind. But he knew its strength. He had felt it. He had lost everything to it. Still standing there in the quiet dawn, he realized something had changed. The river hadn't moved against him. It had simply moved. It was not the river that had taken her. It was the world, in its endless turning, that demanded he learn to live beside what he could not undo. He reached for the fence post, gripping the rough wood until his knuckles paled. "I'll try," he whispered. Luna flicked an ear, her tail brushing against him lightly, like a nod. The wind shifted. The river glimmered. For the first time, Elias looked at it without flinching. The sight still hurt, but it no longer felt like punishment. When he turned back toward the house, Luna followed. The rain had stopped. The valley exhaled. It was not peace, not yet, but it was the beginning of one. The sky darkened with the slow certainty of something large closing in. Rain came in thick bands that smelled of turned earth and distant metal, and the valley, which had held its breath for so long, seemed to gather itself toward one purpose. Elias rose before dawn and moved through the house with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned to make small things hold. He fed the animals, checked the gate latches, wrapped wet burlap around cracked harness leather. Each small repair felt like an apology in motion, an attempt to stitch the world back together, stitch by stubborn stitch. Luna shadowed him, never leaving the range of his steps. She walked with the slow surety of an animal that knew precisely where to go in the dark, to water, to shelter, to the places where people kept their promises. When he opened the barn door, she pushed inside with him and nudged at the other animals, guiding them into stalls with a gentle insistence that seemed almost deliberate. Elias watched her and felt, for the first time in years, the raw possibility that something living could still choose him. By mid-morning, the first real sheets of rain began to fall, drumming the tin roof like a new kind of drum. The river swelled as if answering the valley's call. Word travelled along fences and over hedgerows. The road downriver had already flooded in places, and a neighbour's outbuilding had taken on water. People who had kept distance from Elias for years, old rivals, the trader's son, even the woman who once took in stray colts, began to arrive at his gate with offers of help and news. They were practical things: rope, a spare saddle, a suggestion where to move stock. But each arrival pulled at a soft seam in him, an invitation to rejoin the thin, delicate web of human things. Elias accepted without ceremony. Together they moved animals to higher ground, cows and goats, a skittish mare from the Wilkes place, a pair of sheep that kept pressing toward the fence like hopeful children. When the neighbour with the truck suggested taking a few horses down the ridge to the old grain store, Elias shook his head. "No," he said, voice rough. "We'll do it together." The words startled him. They were small and ordinary, but they carried the weight of something he had not allowed himself to give: trust. The storm thickened, and with it came chaos. Lightning struck an old oak near the eastern fence, splintering it into a shower of wet wood that smouldered in the sodden air. Smoke rose and curled. A small fire caught in the underbrush. No one panicked. They worked with the practiced calm of people who had faced the land's moods before. Buckets passed in a chain, coats thrown over embers, a line of bodies dragging a heavy hose from the well. Elias found himself in the center of it, at once ordinary and vital. Hands that had mended harness and hearts, that had once, in a moment of panic, been too late. In the middle of the day, word came that a mare at the far end of the pasture had been spooked and bolted toward the river. The neighbor who saw her said she had run straight for the old crossing, where the channel narrowed and the current sharpened. Elias did not hesitate. He dropped the bucket he was carrying and ran toward the path that led down to the riverbed. Luna followed as if she had been waiting for him to move. The descent smelled of wet clay and clean water. The sound of the river was now a steady, insistent voice. Down in the hollow the water roared with a new hunger, carrying branches and straw like flotsam. In the distance, a dark shape danced at the water's edge, a mare with a coat turned fierce by fear, rearing as the current surged around her. She had been one the trader had brought years ago, a fine animal whose owner had left in search of work in the city and never returned. Now she fought the water, the line between life and loss drawn in foam. Someone shouted that the mare was tangled in a rope. Her halter had caught on a submerged post, and each time she tried to turn, the current twisted the bind tighter. Her eyes were wide with terror. She bellowed, a sound that pried into the chest like a hand. Elias saw her and felt something inside him, old and jagged, pull taut. He waded into the shallows without counting the cost. The water seized his boots, tugged at the leather of his trousers, and pushed his legs aside like a playful child. It slammed into his chest and kept coming, cold and bright and terrible. He felt it grab at him, trying to force him downstream, but the memory that lived behind the muscles in his back did not let him falter. The scream of his daughter, the rope that had snapped, the clean, indifferent way the current had taken what nothing else could return. Luna whinnied from behind, her voice ragged with worry. Elias turned long enough to see her trembling, but steady, forelegs braced, eyes fixed on him. The water rose to his waist. He kept moving, each step a negotiation between force and will. Halfway across, something surged, a log perhaps, or a tangle of roots, and the mare lurched, dragged by the rope's bite. Elias lunged reckless. He grabbed the halter with both hands and felt the animal thrash beneath his grip. The rope burned his palms, but he held on. For a terrible second, the river had him more than he had it. It shoved him sideways, and he tasted iron. He felt the mare's weight surge, felt the ropes pull like a second heartbeat. He could have let go. He could have turned and fought to stay upright on the bank, denying the current everything. But the image that came then was not of loss, but of an answer. His hand in that girl's small fingers, pulling, always pulling, and his failure carved sharp as winter. He did not want to fail again. He set his feet, planted them deep into the soft alluvium, and leaned his weight against the animal. Inch by inch they moved, water sucking, branches scraping. The sound of the valley turned into one long, brutal hymn. The mare's breath was ragged against his cheek. She twisted her head and met his eyes as if to ask whether he would stay. He whispered a name he had not spoken aloud for years, his daughter's name, and in that whispered sound there was prayer and apology braided tight. Hours might have passed in those minutes. The river repeated itself, a heave, a surge, a sudden slackening. Twice it tried to take them. Twice Elias fought back. Men from the bank threw lines and hooked at the halter, and a younger neighbor waded in to take some weight off. Together they heaved, he and the horse, and the hands that reached toward him, until with a final, exhausted plant of hooves, the mare broke free from the submerged post and staggered toward the nearer shore. They collapsed in a tangle of fur and dripping coats, lungs sobbing, hearts racing like trapped birds. Luna stood at the edge, shaking, nostrils wide. Elias lay on the mud and laughed in a sound that was more like weeping, sharp, amazed, stunned. Around them, the people who had come to help breathed and swore under their breath and clapped shoulders. The bond that had once seemed irreparably severed between him and the valley, between him and other people, had, in that frantic salvage, been rewoven. When the mare finally stood, shaking water from her flanks, she turned her head and nudged Elias with a soft insistence, a warm and living thank you. He ran a hand along her neck, fingers sticky with riverweed and mud, and they sat together on the bank until the hollow around them slowed to the rhythm of dripping eaves. The storm slackened into a fine, steady rain that tasted of iron and good fortune. That night in the barn, people shared a pot of stew warmed over a small cook fire. There was no speech about saints or sins, only the practical talk of mending ropes, of checking gates, of the next tide line to watch. But Elias felt a quiet lift in him, the first breath of a man stepping back into a life that asked for things of him again. He slept deeply for the first time in years, Luna's flank warm against his shoulder. When he woke to the pale light of dawn, the valley seemed to hold its breath in a kinder way. The river had settled into its bed, carrying away the broken twigs and the fear. He rose and walked to the fence, where mud clung to his boots like proof. He looked across the water and did not flinch. In his chest, a small, certain thing had shifted. Forgiveness was not something to be found elsewhere. It was a path he had to take, step by heavy, deliberate step. Outside, someone began the work of hauling downed posts from where they'd crashed in the night. The sound of those voices, ordinary and steady, wove into the valley like thread. Elias set his shoulders and joined them, feeling the pull of community as an old, stubborn tide. He would not be the man who only kept ghosts. He would answer to the living. The morning after the storm was silent in the way only survival can be. The valley lay blanketed in fog, every sound softened to a hush. Water dripped from the trees, the fields shimmered with mist, and the river, finally full again, moved with quiet certainty through its old channel. It was no longer angry. It simply was. Elias stood barefoot on the porch, his trousers rolled to the knee, watching the slow drift of light through the fog. The world smelled new, damp wood, wet hay, and the faint sweetness of earth reborn. His hands were bandaged, his body aching, but the pain felt deserved, earned. It was proof that he had done something worth feeling. Down by the barn, Luna grazed with the rescued mare. Their flanks brushed as they moved together through the wet grass, their coats gleaming with the morning's sheen. They looked like kin, two survivors bound by the same river and the same man. Elias watched them for a long time before stepping down into the mud. Each footfall pressed into the ground with soft sound, a rhythm that matched his breath. He walked to the water's edge. The river moved slow and deep now, its surface smooth, except where stones broke it into silver ripples. For the first time in years, he did not see it as an enemy or a thief. It had taken, yes, but it had also returned. It had carried him through to this place, this stillness, where grief had turned from wound to scar. He knelt and placed his hand in the water. It was cold, shockingly alive. Beneath the surface, silt swirled like smoke. He closed his eyes and whispered her name, the name he hadn't spoken since the flood. Clara. The sound was small, carried off by the current almost at once. But, in that instant, he felt her everywhere, the warmth of morning light on his back, the rhythm of the river beneath his palm, the steadiness of Luna's breath behind him. The world for the first time did not echo. It answered. He opened his eyes and found Luna standing beside him. She had crossed the damp field without sound, her mane still tangled from the night's storm. She looked at him, ears pricked, and then stepped forward into the shallows. Water lapped at her fetlocks. She lowered her head and drank, the ripples widening around her like soft rings of time. Elias smiled faintly. "You crossed," he said. The mare lifted her head, droplets sliding from her muzzle like beads of glass. She took another step, then another, until the water brushed her knees. Elias followed, his boots sinking into the soft riverbed. Together they stood midstream, the man who once feared this river and the animal who once refused it. The current pressed gently against them, neither cruel nor kind, simply constant. Elias let it wash over his hands, his wrists, his arms. Each wave carried a memory and left it softer. His breath came steady. He thought of his daughter, not the night she died, but the days before it, her laughter, her patience, her quiet courage. He remembered her teaching Luna to trust the water, wading in barefoot while the horse hesitated. "She'll follow if I do," she'd said, and she had been right. Now, years later, the circle closed. The mare had crossed. The man had followed. The river had forgiven them both. A faint sound drifted on the wind, voices distant but growing nearer. The neighbors were returning to rebuild fences, to check on livestock, to share food. Elias turned toward the sound, and for once he did not shrink from it. He raised a hand and waved, the motion awkward, but genuine. The figures waved back. Someone shouted his name. He smiled. By afternoon, the fog burned away, revealing a valley cleansed and glistening. Piles of debris marked the storm's passage, but the fences would be mended, the ground reseeded, life coaxed back from ruin. The people worked in quiet rhythm, their laughter low but real. Elias joined them without being asked. He lifted timber, hammered posts, and led the younger men to where the water still pooled. His movements were steady, sure, each task a conversation with the land he had once abandoned. When the work was done and the sun began to drop behind the western ridge, he returned to the riverbank. Luna followed, her head lowered, her breath steaming softly in the cooling air. Elias sat down, his reflection joining hers in the fading light. The river whispered below them, carrying away the last remnants of storm and sorrow. He reached out, touched her muzzle and smiled, not in triumph, but in peace. "You did good," he said. "We both did," Luna's ears flicked toward his voice. The wind shifted, and somewhere in its motion, he thought he heard his daughter's laughter, distant, fleeting, carried downstream toward a world that was finally ready to hold it. The sun sank, leaving the valley wrapped in a soft gold hush. The river kept moving, unchanged and eternal, and Elias, for the first time since the flood, stayed to watch it flow without fear. Weeks passed, and the valley healed in slow, deliberate ways. The fields, once flattened by floodwater, grew thick with new shoots, green as forgiveness. The river had settled into its calm, steady rhythm, no longer the creature of wrath it once had been. In the evenings, when the sun dipped low behind the ridge, its surface shimmered like molten glass, carrying the colors of fire and peace in equal measure. Elias rose with the dawn each day, the weight that had lived in his shoulders gone, replaced by something quieter, purpose or maybe grace. He mended what could be mended and let the rest return to earth. He rebuilt the corral, but not as it was. The fences stood wider apart now, lower, meant to guide rather than contain. Luna watched him from the shade of a sycamore tree, her tail flicking in the lazy rhythm of summer flies. Neighbors stopped by more often. They didn't ask about the flood anymore. Instead, they brought stories, laughter, small things, a jar of honey, a loaf of bread, a bolt of cloth. Once the Wilkes boy brought a stray colt that refused to eat.
"He needs company," the boy said.
Elias nodded and led the colt into the pasture. Luna, ever patient, approached and began to nuzzle the trembling creature until he calmed. Watching them, Elias smiled. The quiet between moments no longer felt like an ache. It felt like breath. The days grew long and warm. Fireflies returned to the riverbank, their light pulsing like heartbeats across the dusk. Elias spent his evenings there, sitting on the flat stone his daughter once used as a skipping perch. He carved small wooden figures in her memory, horses mostly, their forms smoothed by thumb and time. Each one carried a different posture, some in flight, some at rest, one kneeling mid-drink. When he finished, he placed them in a small wooden box beside the porch, a shrine not to loss but to what remained. One evening, as twilight stretched its last gold threads across the water, he opened the box and took one figure, the smallest, carved from a piece of driftwood the flood had left behind. Its shape was simple, unpolished, but its stance held movement, readiness, grace. He carried it to the riverbank.
Luna followed, her steps slow and sure, the colt trailing behind her. He knelt at the edge of the water.
The air was soft, filled with the sound of insects and the whisper of grass. "You'd have liked this year," he murmured. The valley came back better than before. He set the little horse figure on the surface of the river. For a moment it wobbled, then caught the current and drifted downstream, spinning slowly as it went. Luna lowered her head and snorted softly, her breath rippling the water. Elias reached up and rested his hand against her cheek. "Go on," he said quietly. "See her off." The mare stepped forward until the water lapped at her hooves. The colt followed, hesitant at first, then confident. Elias stood behind them, watching the wooden figure glide away until it disappeared around a bend where willows leaned into the stream. A breeze lifted through the valley, carrying the scent of clover and clean water. As the last light faded, Elias looked toward the house. Its windows glowed with lamplight, warm and steady. For years that house had been a tomb, a keeper of ghosts.
Now it was a home again.
He thought of the people who would come tomorrow, the Wilkes boy, the neighbor with the sharp laugh, the teacher from town who had offered to bring books for the children. The world had widened again. Quietly, without permission, he took a deep breath. The air filled him without resistance. Behind him, Luna shook herself, droplets scattering like sparks. The colt kicked at the shallows, splashing her. For a heartbeat, the sound, her playful huff, the river's laughter, was so close to the memory of his daughter's voice that it no longer hurt. It only felt whole. Elias walked back toward the porch, his boots leaving soft impressions in the wet soil. The mare followed at his shoulder, her presence a rhythm he no longer questioned. At the steps he turned once more toward the river. The moon had risen, casting the valley in a silver veil. The water shimmered beneath it, alive, eternal.
Free. He tipped his hat, not in farewell, but in gratitude. The river whispered back,
carrying his thanks to places unseen. In the quiet that followed, Elias sat on the porch, listening to the creak of wood, the sigh of wind, and the gentle breathing of the horses in the field. Fireflies blinked above the grass, tiny lanterns marking the pulse of a world reborn. The valley slept, the river kept moving, and for the first time since the flood, Elias allowed himself to close his eyes without fear of what memory might bring. When he dreamed, there was no storm, only the steady rhythm of hooves crossing water, and a voice, soft and certain, saying, "It's all right now," and in the dream he believed it.